So we are on week 11 of this conversation of the Church of Us versus Them. Actually, you know what? I'm going to record this so I can use it later. There we go. So we're on week 11 and we're up to the appendix number 2. And so normally at this time, what I do is I ask you if you have any initial thoughts. But because we are in the appendix, I just actually want to start into his 5 suggestions for combating the enemy-making machine. So we've been reading The Church of Us versus Them by David Fitch, and we are at the very last page. And so I'm going to put it up on the screen, and we're going to work through these one by one. All right, great. We have more people rolling in. I'm happy to see you all this morning. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen with you. So we're up to week 11, and here's suggestion number 1, tactics for engagement. Number 1, tell a story. Non-conceptual. So that's the first thing is, it's tough to argue with stories. And so I actually just wanted to say, well, I'm still admitting people in the waiting room. I just wanted to say that I think this is one of the things that our congregation does really well. And as I read through this, I thought, I'm actually really happy that I will be able to say to the congregation that I think this is actually an area of strength. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I see Will Mitchell's name up there. Will immediately came to my mind. I have appreciated Will's perspective so much, both from growing up rural and maintaining contact with people in rural Oregon, and just stories of how life looks different outside of Portland. I think Will's done a great job. Also, for his experiences in Asia and being married into a family that's still rooted in Asia. So between his rural, Will, I'm talking about you.
Yeah, okay.
Between his rural connections and his Asian connections, Will always brings a valued perspective, and I've so appreciated him as a conversation partner to remind us that life can look different outside of Portland and outside of the United States. So I've always appreciated that. I also wanted to highlight Pat Crawford. Her stories are always both interesting to me, but she seems to be able to represent people who have been through different experiences in life in a way that informs the conversation. And that's been something I've really appreciated about her. Lorraine Crawford, for specifically, I thought of her work experiences and her different church and neighborhood experiences that she has helped me to really find, I don't know if you want to say balance, but alternative perspective, that not everybody is reading off of the same script. And so those are just a couple people I wanted to highlight that I've really valued their different stories. Minda does a great job of reminding us of people who grew up outside of the tradition and how something might sound or look to them a little different, and I always appreciate that. So, and Kira and Daniel will tell us what it looks like in different churches around the country that they have tried different things in and different regions that they've lived in. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciate you all as conversation partners, and that I think that telling stories is something that we do well. It's sort of a narrative framework that we come to. And I might as well throw in John Espy as long as I'm highlighting people. John has very interesting stories of both his work experience and his various religious experiences. And so I have been greatly nourished and encouraged by your stories. So I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful for you as conversation partners. All right, great. I'm assuming your silence is receiving that affirmation. Okay, good. But let's talk about some things about stories that are to be avoided or to be we have to be cautious with. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I made a couple notes about some elements of stories that I want to be careful of. So the first is politicians do this poorly. So I want to illustrate something for you. If you've ever been watching a debate or a political speech, Sometimes politicians will say, when I was in Utah, I met a young boy named Timmy who lost his leg to cancer. And he was telling me blah, blah, blah. And I want to say to Timmy, we'll get health care, right? You know what I'm saying? That's not the kind of storytelling we're looking for. Because you don't have an actual relationship with the person, you're really using them, almost appropriating their story for your end, and it comes across as disingenuous. So that definitely is a bad model of storytelling. Any reflections on that before I give another caution? You're nodding in agreement. Okay, good. You all know what I'm talking about, right? It just comes off as shallow, and that's definitely not. That's borrowing someone's story to make your point, and that's not what we're going for. Another one is the anecdote, and I've really run into a problem personally because I have migrated theologically or spiritually so much, but I have maintained a relationship with people from my previous camp, that stream of religious perspective. And so oftentimes when I think that I've made a very good point, the person will combat saying, I don't agree, and then they'll tell me a story about one person for whom that didn't work. And so I've really had to figure out what to do with the anecdote of, just because one person, right, that didn't work for, that doesn't undo what I'm talking about. And so I think that there's something to be cautious about, especially in the argument culture that we live in, that's so adversarial, so full of conflict and animosity, that if you use someone else's story to combat the point that somebody else is making, and I'm assuming we do that too, but I'm just very aware that those who come from a more conservative perspective will often latch onto a story for about one person for whom it didn't work as a point of resistance to making any change at all. And so for me, that's become a real obstacle that I've had to overcome. And I don't know if you all have experienced that at all.
Well, I wanted to go back to what you're saying about a politician.
Yeah.
Talking about somebody they met. And maybe that's what they have to do to try to somehow connect to people, because especially at the national level, they're representing millions of people. And
yeah.
So maybe it's hard for them. They wouldn't want to talk about the lobbyists that they meet with all the time.
Right.
They'll try to make some kind of connection with constituents.
No, I appreciate that, and I see what they're trying to do. I think it's because for most politicians, it seems like they aren't real people, right? They don't live real lives. They live inside this bubble, like you said, of meeting with lobbyists. And so I know it's their attempt to humanize the story or the issue, but I really think that it comes off as disingenuous. If it's somebody you just met, you got a snapshot of their life, and then you sort of make it into a sound bite, that does come across. Maybe it's just me. My BS meter starts wavering.
There's also, I remember Joe the plumber. It's like, is Joe the plumber somebody real, or are you just making this up? A contrast where a politician can speak, I think, more authentically would be like Joe Biden talking about the loss of his son or the loss of his wife. That's a personal experience that he's relating, as opposed to talking about Joe the plumber that he ran into someplace down, in Podunk.
Yeah.
In the State of the Union speech, when Trump has all these people stand up and tell their little story, it just comes across to me as phony.
Yeah. Yeah, I think especially in a media age like we live in, when we utilize people for our purposes, there is something to be careful of staging a spectacle, if you will, because people are not spectacles. And when we make a spectacle out of them, there's something not just insulting, but actually misleading a little bit, because the person behind that story is part of a much larger web of relationships, experiences, and community that has led to that. And so to extract this one talking point out of their experience of being human to use for your political ends, I really do think that it's something to be cautious of. But you can disagree with me. I'm proposing that.
Well, and you were talking about anecdotes. It always bothers me when you have legislation by anecdote. Thinking back, you remember Terry Schiavo, the woman that was essentially brain dead in a vegetative state, and they were trying to decide whether to pull the plug, and Congress got involved, using her as the example, trying to legislate nationally for the entire country based on one person in one instance.
Yeah. Yep. No. Go ahead, somebody.
I was going to say, I think that since one person can't experience all, and yet they're trying to legislate for all, and when you were talking about extracting individual stories or anecdotes, and you at the State of the Union address, and every president has somebody stand up to be the example of whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think it is an attempt to try and bring a human face to the situation, and I don't know how you really get around that.
Oh, I do.
You just have to say, okay, that's an example.
No, I think you just helped me make my point. My point wasn't really, I don't think, as airtight as it's about to be. So here's the contrast I would draw. When we have church here physically, and I invite someone to the table, the downside is it's not scripted, right? But the reason it's not scripted is I want them to represent themselves. So I would say the major difference is if you don't hear their voice, you're not hearing their story. It's only when they represent themselves and they can bring in nuance or background or rabbit trails that sort of fill out the picture. When you're telling someone else's story, you're controlling that narrative. And so if the person doesn't have voice, that is something that gives me caution. I'm not saying we can't ever do it.
I think it's in that case you understand that person actually has the experience. So then it kind of is like the pebble going out. It has less credence the further out from that person, the speaker. Okay, so if it's the speaker who has the experience, if it's the speaker and his relative, you have a little more understanding. But if it's the speaker and Joe Blowoff, then you go, okay.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of relationship and intensity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I'm not saying you can never do it, but I'm saying that there's an integrity required to doing that, especially because if you have a power dynamic, for instance, positionally, if you're the pastor and you have a microphone, sharing that microphone, right, is a point of power. And so having that person be able to represent themselves into the microphone gives them agency, right? It elevates their perspective. And so what we see in the State of the Union, it's not like the person gets invited to the stage and gets to speak into the microphone. We never hear their voice. No. And so that's the spectacle element that makes me cautious. So one last point on this thing about sharing stories that I thought you might find interesting, I'll put it up on the screen, is make sure you have the credibility to tell that story. And the reason I bring this up, as many of you know, my mentor and friend, Randy Woodley, from a Native American perspective, he has stories that I can't tell. Now listen, I'm not saying I shouldn't tell them. I'm saying I can't tell them. I'll give you a for instance. He has a story. It's a bear story. He heard it from an elder one time and asked the elder for permission to tell that story. And the elder told him that it costs a bear claw. So years went by with Randy not being able to tell that story. Then one time he was being honored in a ceremony and he was given a bear claw. He was able then to return to that elder and give the elder the bear claw. And now Randy can tell the bear story that I can't. So every fall when I teach my seminary course on communication back east, I tell them there are stories you don't have the credibility to tell. And without exception, and this is my favorite thing, somebody will raise their hand and say, "What's the bear story?" I say, I literally can't tell you that story. It's not mine to tell, right? But in Western culture, we think that every story we just have automatic access to. And I truly think that we need to be cautious with this. I hear sermons on a regular basis where the preacher will tell a story that she or he has not lived through. And they tell that story, and I think, I'm not sure you have the bear claw to tell that story. That wasn't your experience, and there's something about it that seems, at least we should be cautious, but maybe it's disingenuous. So I think culturally we need to be careful, because the legacy of colonialism is that once we show up on somebody's shore, this land is our land, right? These resources are our resources, and your tradition, we can borrow those too, right? Whether that's blankets or corn or stories or understandings. And that's a legacy of colonialism, that what's yours is mine.
You know, Bo, I'm so glad you're talking about this. I have a colleague who does this kind of thing often, and it's always just felt awful when he's done it, but I've never been able to put my finger on why. And now as I listen to you, I realize it's kind of a violation.
Yeah.
There's a violence to it. It's crossing a boundary that you haven't been invited to cross.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is very, very helpful. It's just always given me the creeps when I've heard him do that.
Yeah. You know, one of the principles I try and live by is to never say something about someone you haven't said to them. That's one of my principles I try and live by, which, by the way, it's so inconvenient. I hate that I ever bought into this idea. Do you know how nice it would be to say something about John Espy when he's not around that I've never told him, right? Do you know how nice that would be? So that's the first layer. But the second layer is, if I ever want to share this, I've got to go and tell John, hey, just so you know, like, when you do that or tell that story, here's how that reads to me. And I just wanted you to know that. That's a freaking awkward conversation. So it's just easier to badmouth him when he's not around.
Thank you, Bo. You've just called me out. I'm calling out my colleague.
Oh my gosh. Honestly, I think that pastorally, that principle has probably saved me, years of trouble in my life. But it really is quite a self-limitation to say I'm going to try and live by this. And I don't always do it. And boy, but it has really been a life-giving principle for me. And so how I would apply it here is, if you tell someone else's story, you probably owe it to them to tell them that you tell their story. Now, that may become a blessing to them to say, you know, when you told me the story about this experience that you had, I just want you to know, I've been able to share that with several people and how much it has encouraged them, right? Like, that might be a real blessing to them. But they might also come back to you and say, I really wish you wouldn't tell that story. I sort of told that to you in confidence. right? There's an accountability to say, is it all right with you if I tell this story? So sometimes people will ask me, well, in what context do you use it? And so I'll say, all right, well, I have this guy, he's a pastor of a more conservative denomination, and I told him this to say to him, hey, you may not know who's sitting in the pew and know how this thing you say, how it sounds to them. And so I've used it as a caution, and they're like, okay, I guess that would be all right. So it might be a blessing, but it's also an accountability. John, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I guess when you tell a story, I mean, if it's out of the Bible, that's fine. If it's out of any other book, that's fine. It's just a story that people have told you verbally that you need to ask for permission.
Right. Once somebody writes something down, the text is outside the control of the author. I mean,
in the example that Minda gave, the fact that she didn't name the person, she's not gossiping about a person, but simply presenting something that she's experienced. Is that okay, or is that rationalizing?
What do you think?
I would say that's not okay.
It's not okay?
Well, even though you don't name the person, you are really identifying the person with the story.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering if none of us can guess who the person is. Would that be okay? She might inadvertently introduce us to that person later, and then we might think, oh, okay, I remember you talking about this. So,
I knew this pastor one time that had tattoos on his arm and a beard, and
You know what's funny is, because this is not an agreed upon thing that happens in our congregations or community, I cannot tell you how many times, and Vermont Hills isn't the only church, but every church I've ever worked at, I will sometimes tell stories anonymously. I'll say, oh, I was talking with somebody this week and they pointed out blah, blah, blah. And they'll be like, was that Donna? And I'm like, if I had wanted you to know who it was, I would have said Donna. I said somebody, don't worry about who it is.
It was Donna.
It was Donna. All stories are Donna.
Oh, can't hear you, Donna.
Oh, she's trying out a new microphone this morning.
Can't hear you.
It's still not on.
I can hear her just fine.
You're kidding.
Whoa.
Huh.
I can hear her just fine.
What's she saying? Repeat it.
My memory, I'm old. I'm turning 65 this week. My memory's gone.
That's what she's saying?
Happy birthday.
That's what Donna's saying?
No.
No, I'm just, giving you a life example of how your memory goes.
Oh, boy. Our friend Julio on the other stream says, what is most personal is most universal. So that would be in favor of sharing a story. All right, so I'm going to go on to Fitch's second proposal for combating the enemy-making machine. He says, make observations and ask questions that reveal the contradictions at work. Don't make enemies. Don't demonize the other. Open space. Whose image and inscription are on this coin? Now, I found it interesting that we are in Luke chapter 20 this week in Bible study. And so Jesus, they're trying to trap him about taxes. And he says, well, show me a coin. And they do. He says, whose image is on it? And they said, well, Caesar's. He's like, well, then give to Caesar's. And so we were joking, like if Glennis had a dollar bill that had Glennis's picture on it, then that would be her money. But if it has the government, right, like a president's picture on it, that's not your money. You're utilizing it, right, as a steward, but that's not yours. And Jesus totally bought out of the either or binary that was presented him and went with a non-dual answer. And so he was a bit of a magician this week. So by asking questions can be very, very powerful. Actually, sometimes far more powerful than making a point.
I think asking questions is makes the other person think about where they actually are, rather than you telling them what they're thinking or how they're wrong. At least it allows them to explore something.
Yeah. It takes a lot more energy to come up with a good question.
It does. It's so much harder.
Oh. I like when I ask people questions and then they say to me, I'm not sure that's the right question. So you say, what's a better question? And that's a really interesting way to have a conversation, is they'll say, I think the bigger question is this. I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have known to ask that. Sometimes when I'm done with a conversation, if it's been a really difficult conversation, I will say to the person at the end, is there anything I'm going to wish I had asked you that I currently don't know to ask you? And sometimes the person will give you, if they trust you, they will give you something that you're like, oh, I didn't even think of that. Right? Like, there's no way you could know everything that's going on behind the scenes. You can only address that which is accessible to you. So sometimes people got a lot going on behind the scenes.
Very good point.
Yeah.
I use that question when I'm trying to decide between two different things, like buying a car. What should I ask this other person
Yeah.
about their car that I'm not asking?
Yeah, that's a good example.
Asking questions is very powerful. I never can figure them all out.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder, though, this question that Jesus is asking about, who's on the coin. I can't think of an example, but I think there have been times when I've asked questions about things where people have thought, oh, that's odd. Why is he asking that? Or what's he after?
Yeah.
And so I think some people can find it off-putting.
That is true.
Yeah, as a therapist, questions, we really study how to ask good questions and open questions and closed questions. But I think of questions as a hook. They demand a response, and they are more arousing for the person you ask the question to than just making a statement. And so, it's navigating. Do I make a statement here? Or do I ask a question? Do I ask an open question? Do I ask a closed question? And am I wanting to lead by asking the question, or am I wanting to open up and learn a whole bunch of new stuff? So, but I think questions are hooks because they do demand an answer, and they get us more aroused.
Yeah. Whenever I take long road trips, whether it's as a youth pastor with a van full of youth group kids, or with family members in the car, or my friends going on a camping trip, I have this game I like to play. We call it the money game. And I just ask a question like, if you had to spend $20 at the next rest stop, what would you buy? Right? So that just gets it going. And then incrementally, we just go up in dollar amounts. I have learned more interesting things about my traveling partners. Like when you get up to money, like if you had to spend $2,000 by the end of today on one thing, what would you buy? One thing, you had to spend $2,000 by the end of today. People will tell you all sorts of things. Or if you had $50,000, but it could only go towards one thing, right? But it opens up things you would never know. So it's a really fun game, and I love it.
Yeah. People tell you what they value.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
So Minda, I'm curious, do you have any books on how to ask questions?
Nothing comes to mind right now, but I'll look through my library and see if I have anything.
I do.
Okay, Bob.
I have books of questions. Yeah, I'll loan you some.
But I think, like Minda was saying, there's situations where you want to ask an open question.
Yeah.
There's situations where you want to ask a closed question. So you do both?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think that might be a good subject matter sometime.
Oh, all right.
Like how to do questions for different situations.
Very good. I'd be up for that. That sounds like a fun one. All right, here's his third suggestion. Do not humiliate or defeat the other person. And I added, winning an argument versus winning over your sister or brother. This has become, for me, a lifelong passion. I've actually developed a saying that I would rather be in right relationship than be right in the relationship. So I'd rather be in right relationship than be right. And it's tough, especially as an opinionated white guy with a big voice. I used to love to be right. I still desire deeply. I love being right. But my heart has been really changed by prioritizing being in right relationship over being right. So there are times where I say, like, this person and I don't agree, but I'd rather stay friends with them than deliver the knockout blow to this argument. And for me, it's a really important thing. So I liked this point that Fitch made.
I don't know that you're going to change their mind anyway. You could give them a knockout blow and give them something to think about, but they're probably not going to change their mind right then anyway.
But you have to admit, delivering that knockout blow, like laying that card on the table, the trump card, it's so satisfying.
It is Trump.
The mic drop moment is fantastic, where you know you did it, you just boom, walk away. That feels so good for like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Hey, Will, check out a book called it's by Robin Myers, called Questions Jesus Asked.
Okay, thanks.
One of our friends on the other stream is suggesting that. Robin Myers, Questions Jesus Asked. Sounds interesting.
Got it, thank you.
All right. Fourth suggestion. Start with agreement. I cannot agree more with this, how powerful it is. And so I've really become a huge fan of diagramming things in the Venn diagram. Just draw two overlapping circles and start in the middle with the overlap. Don't start with where you know there's difference. Start with where you know there's agreement. It really transforms the conversation. So what I actually do is, you have like Republican, let's say Republican and Democrat. So don't worry about where they differ. Start with the agreement, right? On democracy and representative governments, right? What are the agreement? And what I like to do is I actually add a fourth category. So not only where the overlap is of agreement and then where there's difference, but then I also try and account for something that is not a part of that debate. So for instance, people will often say, half the country voted for this person. And I'll say, no, they didn't. Actually, half the country didn't vote. Half of eligible voters didn't vote. So that means only a quarter of the country voted for this person. Half those who voted, but that's only a quarter of the people. So not all the views are represented here. And you have to just keep in mind that as much as the split screen a life that we live in, of the either or debate of representing both sides of the argument or whatever it is, that's a false presentation. Because we don't live in a split screen world. Most people who are affected by this thing aren't even visible in that format. And so we're presented a fiction or a false narrative in our either or debate culture. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's something we often forget,
Yeah.
that I do believe that we actually have a lot more in common than our differences, even though our differences can be pretty astounding. But if we really look on a one-to-one basis, we really are more alike than different.
Agreed. Agreed. In fact, when you start with agreement, one of the things you might find is that overlap of the two Venn circles is actually far more important than where the difference is occurring. The difference sometimes seems very slight when you take time to examine it. But if you don't look at it that way, then all you see is how polar the extremes are and how polarized the issue is.
And not only that, when you go from your opposition, it's harder to figure out where you are in agreement.
That's true.
If you're in opposition, you don't find your agreement. You're always stuck in what you perceive as how that person's different.
Yep. All right. His final suggestion is make all proposals in the spirit of mutual submission, out of the recognition that Jesus is Lord and at work in this space. End each proposal with the words, I submit to you. Open space for the kingdom and for his spirit to work. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ in Ephesians 5:21. So this is a very Christian final suggestion, but I actually think there's something beautiful to it, which is if you're going to be in a right relationship, you're not always going to agree about everything. So by submitting one to another, you say, I'm not going to leave if I don't get my way. I'm still going to be here. I'm going to be in community, even if I lose this vote. So I submit to you that this thing, whatever it is, I submit that this is a better way, but I'm not leaving if my perspective doesn't win. I think it's a beautiful suggestion. It's difficult to do, but it's a really, really good inclusion in this 5 proposals. You and I live in a world where we self-select community and conversations. And so when we don't like how something's going, we can just change the channel. We just tune out and go a different direction. And so that's how we end up in these echo chambers, these silos of conversation where we're only hearing people that already agree with us because we picked that. We selected that. We pick which news channel to watch. We pick who to friend and who to follow on social media. We pick who to go out to coffee with. We pick who to avoid at the family dinner and not sit by. And so we just have the luxury of doing that. But that's part of what has created this problem that we're trying to address in our culture.
I've heard there's a book called The Big Sort.
Okay.
It talks about how, I think back in the 70s, if you looked at different congressional districts, the votes were much closer. You know, it might be 55% Republican, 45% Democrat, or vice versa. But nowadays, like if you look at Multnomah County, it's more like 80-20, and like the Malheur County where I grew up, it's 80-20 the other way. And so people have self-sorted over the time to live in places where other people are more like-minded.
Yes. You know what's interesting? I'm actually glad you brought that up. I saw a fascinating show this week about how COVID is going to change our electoral maps. Because when this is all sorted out, you called it the sort, that lots and lots of young people, they're not going to want to live in cities in the same way, where there's all this convenience that you can't take advantage of in a post-COVID world. And so they're going to relocate often to either more rural or more suburban places, and it is going to change the electoral map radically. Instead of us grouping together like we have been for the last 40 years in these self-selecting communities, there's going to be a great dispersion.
Yeah, and I guess nowadays, a lot of people like me work from home and can really live wherever they want.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this thing, it might be the lasting legacy of this thing might actually be not just like, for instance, people are starting to question the 5-day work week, because if you can get all your work done in 4 days, right? So you don't have to drive to the office. Real estate is going to change because you don't have to have a big office, right? If people can work from home, it's going to set off a chain of events for education. If kids can get their work done in 2 hours and they don't need to be in school for 6 hours, and if you can live anywhere, post-COVID world could be very different.
Yeah, you don't have to go to the store to buy anything. You can buy it all online.
Yeah, not.
Technically, you don't need to have a church building to have church.
No kidding. Wow.
What's that, John?
I said, no kidding.
I don't know that that's really sustainable.
Let's open these churches.
What did
Oh.
John say? What did John say?
John Crawford, go again.
And Mr. Trump doesn't believe you can have church without a number.
That's true. That's true. And he would know.
Went to church once.
Yeah. However, I don't know how sustainable online church is. There's still something about personal connection
Yeah.
that is very, very much missed by even people working from home. They're wanting to say, but I want to go back to the office. I want to see people. I want to be in contact with people. It's very hard to be isolated like this.
Agreed. By the way, one of my favorite healthcare workers just said on the other stream, a lot of healthcare workers will probably quit.
Ooh.
Wow.
Yeah. There's definitely going to be a shakeup coming out of this. But can I just put in a plug for the Church of Us versus Them? I'm really glad that we've been having this conversation. Obviously, no one could have known what was ultimately going to become of 2012. Oh. And no one could have known what was all of this was going to end up looking like. But I got to say, I love that we have been practicing for whenever we do get released and we go back out there. I'm hoping that we have practiced behind the scenes being agents of change and agents of grace and agents of reconciliation in this world, because there's going to be so much sorting and trying to figure out a way forward. I'm really hoping that we can be, in our little circles of influence, a voice to say, this is a great opportunity to go a different way. And so I love that we've been having this conversation, and I felt like it's very timely. No. Well, next week we are going to launch into the culture wars. And so I've been doing some research on the roots of this over the last 40 years and how we ended up here. And so I hope that you will come back for that conversation next week. We are going to leave behind this Fitch book, and but I will send out something for you to look at this week. I'll post it on the website, on Facebook. It'll be in the email. Something for you to look at. But I hope that you will join me here next Sunday morning at 9:30 to talk about how in the heck did we get here?